Hi Schema, and thanks for tuning into our talk. I'm Ainsley from Asana's Design Systems team. I'm going to kick us off by talking about our team and how we work with Figma. Then Jina and Ivy are going to take you through a case study of how we use design tokens on our recent dark mode project. Our team is made up of virtually equal numbers of engineers and designers, with product and research teammates rounding us out. Because the design system that we maintain is used across disciplines, our team is a mirror of that. We sit together, we sprint plan, cost, execute, check in, and retro together. We consider our projects high-level initiatives that aren't separated by discipline. Like every design system, our job is to make our product usable, consistent, and accessible. Ultimately, we exist to serve our external customers. But day to day, we serve the rest of the design and engineering team by way of office hours, design systems inbox requests, we attend design pillar area crits, we maintain a core component library, and we also have the SOL documentation style guide website. The Asana design team uses Figma to stay in sync. So that means each pillar and area has their own section on Figma that contains works in progress, documents for crits, presentations, and production files. We also maintain universal reference files. So those have patterns and components that everyone will need and use. And then finally, we have Figma libraries that has different color systems like brand, dark mode, and UI. So how that's consumed by our team is, firstly, we have a web UI kit that contains our design system components. When there's changes, there's communication via Slack and Asana around upcoming changes. Then we push changes to libraries, Figma files, and our code base, and that's more or less correlated with what's in code. Figma gives us several tools to replicate the different states of how our components are constructed in code, and in general, we work towards closing the gap between the two so that we can achieve reasonable parity in naming, interaction, and application of color. So that's an overview of how our team functions and uses Figma, and now to get into the specifics of a project is Jina Anne.
Thanks, Ainsley. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. I'm Jina. I'm a design manager on the Asana Design System team. I'm excited to walk through a case study of something we shipped recently, dark mode, and I'll talk about how we use design tokens to do it. Dark mode, of course, is an alternative to our original color theme that basically reverses our color contrast to use a dark gray as the base and the lighter colors as text and accents. This was highly requested from our customers, and it was the perfect first use case for us to implement our first design tokens project because we knew we would be defining a palette that would be used in different ways, and design tokens make that way easier to maintain. So just in case you haven't heard of design tokens, they are a single source of truth to name and store a design decision, such as color, typography, or spacing. This is our main method for achieving a level of abstraction that we use in both our code and design files. Tokenizing and abstracting these design decisions allows them to be distributed across design tools and code languages. If you don't know what I mean by tokenizing, it's similar to what people do when they are localizing text. So if you were to tokenize a string of text and pass in the English version of that text, then you can also pass through other languages. It's like a label or a symbol or a nickname for that text. So this is that same concept, but for design. Most people are familiar with variables, which is something you can use in CSS or CSS preprocessors, but tokens can do a little bit more than that. So if you're also designing for Android or iOS, you might not use CSS. But you can still have a tokenized set of design decisions that can be transformed and distributed to all the platforms you need. This is amazing for better communication and collaboration. In other words, designers, engineers, and multidisciplinary teams can collaborate, speak the same language, and stay in sync across tools and languages. It's agnostic. It's like a Rosetta Stone, to borrow a metaphor from my friend Peter. So when we needed to design for dark mode, we knew that making design tokens for a dark theme would mean first defining a simple palette that is then translated between light and dark modes. This was our previous grayscale palette that we used in the product. It was 7 values for all the jobs a neutral palette needs to accomplish. But one of the designers on our team, Paul Valou, was the main designer on the dark mode project. He initially tried just inverting these colors. But when we tried applying these reverse values, this is what we expected it to look like. But in practice, this is how it turned out. This is a literal inversion of our original 7 colors flipped. What was black became white and vice versa. A caveat that this is an early hacky prototype, but it told us that we needed additional values to create more of a gradient that allowed for subtleties. So for instance, the jump between the background and a banner or the text in the background had way too much contrast. We realized not only did we need more than those original 7 values, but also that we needed to consider dark and light mode palettes separately, that it wasn't just reversing them. So that's what we did, and that's what you can see here, 2 additional values and 2 separate palettes. This let us have more stops for the lighter end of the palette, for the light palette, and more stops on the darker end for the dark palette. So once we gave those palettes additional values and separate considerations, here's what it started to look like. This is the light palette. And here's dark. Much, much better. Once we established the basic neutral palette, we then began to think about the other colors beyond the neutrals. So here you can see the way Paul was thinking through our greens and our reds. Then we used Adobe's Leonardo, which is a color tool that helped us calculate the mathematical contrast jumps needed for the hover and active states, which gave us initial values to work with. One great thing that comes for free with Leonardo is the ability to check multiple color spaces like RGB, HSL, LCH, and so on, and target specific contrast ratios that we want. But we realized that even though Leonardo technically gave us a range of different shades of contrast, that it wasn't accounting for the perceptual differences between higher and lower lightness colors. So for example, these are the blues and pink default plus hover values that we first started with. And these technically have the same contrast jump between them. But you can see that for the case of a hover state, the darker blue value is relatively subtle, while the dark pink value is much more noticeable. So Paul came up with a formula that used the relative lightness of a color to account for how much of a contrast ratio is needed to understand interaction changes like hover. On the y-axis is the range of relative lightness, and on the x-axis you can see that as the lightness increases, the contrast ratio actually lessens. So in that bottom left corner, colors like gray, greens, and blues that have a lower lightness need a larger jump to show a perceptual difference between interaction states. And in the top right corner, colors like pinks and pastels and oranges and reds need a much lower contrast jump. So once we'd established that formula, we could find custom contrast ratios to get a more consistent contrast ratio and for different interaction states. Here you can see that the difference between the pinks and blues are much more consistent. So with all those factors, light and dark palettes, contrast ratios, and accounting for interaction and additional values, we had an extremely robust palette and we're ready to start codifying an underlying structure for it. We wanted to use design tokens as a formalized way of abstracting these colors, so engineers and designers aren't drowning in hex codes. The main motivation for this was so that designers wouldn't have to worry about designing twice, and engineers wouldn't have to worry about implementing twice. Previously, we had 5 colors for every hue, each with simple color names, whose original intention got lost over time, which meant it would be applied inconsistently or incorrectly. Basically, designers were just picking the color that they thought made sense for their use case. And we knew that design tokens could help us embed additional layers of intention, and we wanted folks to be able to orient around a single simplified color palette. So instead of picking from a bunch of reds, you know that you will use danger and then danger hover. So we began to brainstorm what the appropriate naming conventions would be. into the design token information. Luckily, I've done this before at previous companies, so I was able to make some suggestions for the team, and I'm very happy with where we landed. And we discussed in depth what kind of categories and variations that we would want represented in the naming and what order it would go in. Ivy, who you'll hear from in a moment, helped us land on our current naming convention. So the only one required is the usage, like background, text, border, and then you can tack on things like a sentiment, a prominence, and an interaction. So here's an example of a background and a text token that exists in the context of a selected sentiment. And then we add on the hover state for the stronger shades. And you can see below how we represented that in Figma through the naming of our color styles. And ta-da, a much better dark mode that is maintainable, easy to update, and has long-term longevity, even if we ever decide to do a refresh design later. Since the token system is in place, we just change the values in the token definitions, and it will propagate out to all the instances in our design tools and code. So I touched a little bit on the naming conventions for our token names, but Ivy is going to go into a lot more detail on how we implemented, structured, and organized things. Go Ivy!
Thank you, Jina. Hi, everyone. My name is Ivy. I am a software engineer at Asana, and I was an engineering lead on this Design Tokens in Dark Mode project. And I'm going to go into more detail on exactly how we use design tokens in our dark mode implementation to close the gap between design and engineering. So as Jina mentioned, we noticed that there was some loose underlying structure to how color is used. Green is not just green, it conveys somewhat of a positive feeling. Red is not just red, it conveys somewhat of a negative feeling. And likewise, different colors are used to distinguish borders from backgrounds, indicate hover states, and more. We wanted to formalize this loose underlying structure of how we use colors so that colors could be applied consistently across the product. And we do this with design tokens. Design tokens essentially move us to a semantic naming convention. Instead of referencing colors by what they are, we would refer to them with how they're used. I worked very closely with Paul Vallue to take a deep dive into how colors are used at Asana. The goal here was to find out which pieces of semantic information needed to be captured in our design token naming convention. And this was what we came up with. The way colors are used in Asana is broken down into 4 pieces of semantic information: sentiment, usage, prominence, and interaction. These are then combined to form a token name. The first piece is sentiment, which refers to the feeling of what is being conveyed. We wanted to capture this because in our product, there's a strong correlation between sentiment and the hue of the color. So for example, default refers to the neutral palette that's used to build our general UI Chrome. The success sentiment references a green palette, the warning sentiment, a yellow palette, the danger sentiment, a red palette, so on and so forth. The next piece of semantic information we wanted to represent is usage, which refers to where a color is used on a component. So for example, whether the color is being used as the background, text, icon, or border color. We wanted to include this information to ensure that text and icon colors have sufficient contrast with their backgrounds. Next, we have prominence, which refers to how prominent the component appears in the product. And finally, we have interaction, since different colors are used to convey whether a component is in a hover, active, or disabled state. And all of these combined give us the token name. So going through a quick example, in our product, we have the selected toggle button that looks like this when it's being hovered. And to capture its text color semantically, we would combine the following pieces. So here, we use the blue color to indicate that this toggle button is selected. And so for the sentiment, we would choose the selected sentiment. And the color that we're trying to describe references the text, so the usage is text. The prominence is just default. And the interaction that we're trying to describe is the hover state. And so we combine these together to get selected text default hover as our name. And just for simplicity, we just omit the default. And so we would use the token selected text hover as the token to represent this text color. Going through another quick example, in our app, we have a warning top bar component that looks like this. We needed a token to capture its background color. Using our token naming convention, the sentiment we're conveying is the warning sentiment. The usage is to describe its background. The prominence is strong in this case, and the interaction is just the default. And so we combine these pieces together to get warning background strong. So the goal of this naming convention is to be comprehensive and concise. And this was what we had in mind when we were fine-tuning what our token naming convention should look like. Our set of tokens needed to be comprehensive enough to describe most uses of color in our product, and at the same time, we also needed to be concise enough to make it easy to determine which token should be used. The following is the set of tokens that we ended up with. These tokens are stored as Figma color styles and grouped by sentiment because of how strongly this correlates to hue in our product. So here we have the default sentiment tokens, which is the neutral palette that we use to make our UI Chrome. And notice how each token corresponds to two values. So for example, the text token here is a dark color in light mode and a light color in dark mode. An important artifact of this system is that designers only need to design in a single mode. And in practice at Asana, this is typically light mode, and there's no need for designers to worry about dark mode. However, if designers wish to design or preview their work in dark mode, Paul also had added corresponding color styles that shows the tokens in dark mode as well. So moving on to the colored palettes, we have the success sentiment tokens, which are green, the warning sentiment tokens, which are yellow, the danger sentiment tokens, which are red, the selected sentiment tokens, which are blue, the upsell sentiment tokens, which are also yellow, and finally we have the beta sentiment tokens, which are purple. And so now that I've walked you through the color system that we've come up with, I'd like to show you an example of how this system is consumed by Asana's product designers and engineers. So suppose I were a designer looking to design this button. The image on the left is the button in its default state, and the image on the right is what the button looks like when it's being hovered over. With design tokens, designers no longer need to worry about the specific hex values that this button should be, just the correct tokens. So for the default interaction, we would have the danger background token for the background and the danger text token for the text. And for the hover interaction, we would use the danger background hover token for the background and the danger text hover token for the text. This is then handed off to the engineer to build. They would use the danger background token for the background and the danger text token for the text. And for the hover interaction, they would use the danger background hover token for the background and the danger text hover token for the text. Now, if that sounds extremely redundant to what I just described for the design stage, that's because it is, and that's the point. We wanted to achieve parity between the design and engineering phases, and design tokens allows us to do that. The best part about this is when the user selects dark mode, everything just works. We never had to explicitly design nor implement for dark mode, and this keeps our engineering and design velocity up. So taking a peek under the hood, we power our tokens with Sass and CSS variables. We use class name selectors that correspond to the user's preferences to determine the hex value that should be shown. So an engineer only needs to implement everything with the correct tokens, and the system we built takes care of the rest when it comes to theming. And so you might be looking at this and feel a little worried that this seems like a lot of code to maintain. And you'd be right, especially since I'm only showing you the definitions of 4 tokens out of the many we have. And we solve this issue by having all of this code automatically generated with the help of Style Dictionary. Style Dictionary is a token generator tool that takes design decisions and stores them as data and then translates it to various platforms. So we store our token names and the values they correspond to in a JSON file as the single source of truth. This data is then parsed with the help of Style Dictionary to the various formats we need. So for the web app, we use Sass and CSS. For the mobile platforms, we have Swift and XML. and our internal documentation is powered by TypeScript. Unfortunately, we don't have a good way to parse our tokens into Figma color styles, but we also don't have to. Design tokens close that gap by providing a common language between designers and engineers. Working at the level of abstraction that tokens gives us means that we don't have to concern ourselves with the specific value that these tokens correspond to. As long as if you use the appropriate token, the colors just work. Paul and I wanted to really push the boundaries of this concept. And honestly, it started as a joke. What if we made Asana maroon colored? Paul used Leonardo to generate a maroon palette that had the same contrast jumps of the neutral palette that we use for our UI Chrome. I then plugged these values into Style Dictionary and let it generate the updated token definitions. This was the result. This only took us 30 minutes of time to both design and implement. And honestly, I think it looks pretty decent. But there are some practical applications too. So for example, design tokens also power Asana's colorblind-friendly theme. This theme shifts the color palette so that there is more contrast between colors for users who have deuteranopia. Just like with dark mode, designers and engineers don't have to spend extra time building this theme. The fact that we're able to achieve accessibility wins systemically is really exciting to me. I love the fact that as long as designers and engineers use the color system we built, they're building a color accessible product, whether they think about it or not. And so now to wrap us up, I'll hand things back to Ainsley.
So, on our design systems team, we use the technique and philosophy of design tokens to create a level of abstraction that allows designers to design in Figma and engineers to code in a code editor. Using components, variants, and libraries in Figma, designers are able to implement the same ideas that the engineers are applying in code. We don't strive for perfect parity between code and Figma, but rather a system that lets us all play to our strengths in the environments we're comfortable with, while taking away the redundant work that lets us focus on solving the problem. Thank you so much and have a great Schema.